Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Darien Library tonight. We are really lucky to have John Reid, the author of Evergreen, Saving Big Forests to Save the Planet, with us this evening. This has been an event that we've had in the works for quite a while. We have one copy left at the library, but Barrett Bookstore has copies in the store, so you can swing by there tomorrow and pick up a copy. I want to thank the Friends of the Library who make these programs possible, because they endow them, and without that, we would have a hard time putting programs together every night. I'd also like to thank our friends at Barrett Bookstore, who have, as I said, have Evergreen on the shelf. So let me tell you a little bit about John. John Reid is a conservationist and economist whose writing has appeared in outlets including the New York Times and Scientific American. He is the founder and former head of the Conservation Strategy Fund and winner of the MacArthur Foundation Award for Creative and Effective Institutions. He currently serves as senior economist for a nonprofit, Neotira, and lives in Sebastopol, California. His co-writer, Thomas Lovejoy, unfortunately is deceased. He passed away in 2021, but he was instrumental with this book as well. He was a pioneering biologist credited with founding the field of climate change biology. A university professor at George Mason University, he served on advisory councils in the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations, as well as in advisory and leadership roles at the United Nations Foundation and the World Bank, the Smithsonian Institution, and the World Wildlife Fund. I can't thank you enough for joining us tonight. This is such an important topic.
Thank you. Thanks for the warm welcome. Thanks, Darien Library community, for being here this evening. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you all about Evergreen. And so what I propose for our program is I'm going to run through some slides and explain how this book came about, and sort of meander through these 5 big forests that we describe in our book. And then I'll, when we're done with the slides, open it up for questions. And before we get into questions, I'll read a little bit from the book, and then jump into a conversation. So I'm going to share my screen. This book had its origins for me in my decades working in nature conservation, a lot of that time spent working in the tropical forests of South America, and running up against some real challenges in how we made the case for saving the forest. I come from an economics background, and economics is a great discipline for making strategy, for understanding people's financial logic when they're looking at natural resources. But economics is woefully inadequate at understanding the value of large intact ecosystems and in a holistic way. And that really gets in the way of the policy community in countries and at institutions like the World Bank to understand the value of conserving large-scale ecosystems. Now, this shot here was taken from the top of a granite dome in the Rio Negro Basin in Brazil. The Rio Negro is the biggest northern tributary of the Amazon. And I was sitting up there one day in 2016 and watching this storm go by. And as far as I looked to the horizon in any direction from this rock, all I could see was forest. And all of this forest was under the stewardship formerly of indigenous tribes. And the epiphany that I had in that moment was that there's still a bunch of this fully functioning, biodiverse, intact forest with not just its carbon stored and its biodiversity, but its human stewards, the people who've been there for generations beyond counting, still in the forest, still interacting with it, still shaping it and taking care of it. And that that reality doesn't get out to the public in a way that it needs to inspire people, to like show people the ongoing importance of our forests in tackling climate change, and also showing that there are people who've got this figured out, who are successfully living in a relationship with forest. So I started playing around with ideas about, well, how can we talk about this for a general public, the public that needs to get this message. And that took me to a conversation with this gentleman, Thomas Lovejoy. And Tom Lovejoy had been working in Brazil since his PhD days back in the 60s. And starting in the 70s, was showing people how the integrity, the physical integrity of forests was crucial to their functions in climate regulation and in holding biodiversity. So he set up an experiment in the Brazilian rainforest back in the 70s, where forest fragments of different sizes were preserved in an area that was undergoing rapid deforestation. And then control areas in intact forest were compared to them. And over the decades, Tom and a small army of scientists showed which were the species that were going extinct in the fragments, and what would the effect of fragmentation on carbon storage, on moisture, on rain. So that was a sort of beginning for the whole science of forest fragmentation. And then Tom took it another level to show how the whole Amazon basin functioned as one integrated biological and physical system. And late in his life was talking about the whole planet that way. So Tom and I came to the issue of intact forests from different approaches, but fused those and decided to write a 800-word op-ed on this subject. And we did, and that ran in the New York Times in 2018. And we had no idea that where we're going to take the idea any further together. But long story short, we did, and it became the book Evergreen that I hope that you've enjoyed or will enjoy. And in the book, what we did was focus on the 5 largest remaining forests in the world. 2 of them are boreal forests, which maybe you can see my arrow here. What we call the North American megaforest that stretches through Alaska across northern Canada. What we call the Taiga, which is a forest that stretches from Scandinavia all the way to the Pacific coast. And then 3 tropical forests. The biggest, the Amazon, about half the size of the Amazon is the Congo Basin rainforest. And then about half the size of that again is the forest that covers New Guinea and its outlying islands. Now, these forests, if you see 2 different shades of gray here. The lighter shade just means that's the extent of forest cover. The darker shade denotes areas that are at least 500 square kilometers in size, which is about 60,000 soccer fields, with no roads, power lines, mines, industrial agriculture, cities or towns. In other words, none of the human development that is intense enough to fragment the forests. And those are called intact forest landscapes. So these are areas that are continental in scale. In the case of New Guinea, the world's second largest island in scale, and have these intact cores that allow them to perform the planetary functions of absorbing carbon dioxide, holding it securely, having the evolutionary processes be able to unfold at scales that have been compromised in other parts of the world. So first, I'm going to take you to the Congo, where I got to do some really fun travel for this book into forests that I didn't know well. And the Congo really stands out for its big animals and big trees. This is a Western lowland gorilla here eating from this massive tree just behind it. And this is one of the most intact parts of the Congo, the western part of the Congo in the Republic of Congo. And I'm going to play you here a little clip of what that guy looks like walking through the forest. So these are forests that have their great apes, they have forest elephants, and the full complement of species. And the research shows that when you have the full complement of animals, you actually have more plant biomass as well. This is a fig tree where you can't see them, but in the top of this tree, you have chimpanzees and gorillas feeding at the same time. There are really inspiring scientists that I met over the course of the research. This guy is a botanist in the Congo forest, and he's this stuff we have coming out of our ears is a species of wild ginger that is an insect repellent. So he had me stick this stuff in my ears to keep the flies off in the forest. The forest people of the Congo, the original forest people, are the people that we often refer to as pygmies, who actually belong to a dozen different distinct ethnic groups spread throughout the Congo. And nobody knows for sure when their ancestors first migrated into the Congo, but it's at least 30,000 years ago, as much as 60,000 years ago. They started to be colonized by farmers moving in from West Africa 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, and have often been in a subservient social position to the migrants. But incredibly, after thousands of years, the pygmies still have distinct culture, distinct language, and they have this acknowledged role as the human intermediaries with the non-human world of the rainforest. They're always the guys at the front of the line of a group of researchers going in the forest, have these just uncanny navigation skills and this resilient forest knowledge and connection. So we're going to take a big leap here. This is the Taiga, and this is an area near Lake Baikal in Russia. And these are the Sayan Mountains. And the Taiga is the largest of the megaforest. And one really interesting thing when you start digging into the history of Russian environmentalism is that the Russian scientists were the first to come up with an idea of a scientifically designed protected area, something that came to the United States really with Aldo Leopold, and when ecologists started to get involved in the planning of US protected areas. But there were some visionaries doing this back as far as the turn of the 20th century in Russia. So Russia has this network of what are called zapovedniks, which are these strict protected areas, as well as national parks, and a long tradition of an environmental movement that has been one of the most resilient social movements in Russia, and has sort of incredibly survived the Soviet era and is really on the ropes now in the current political era. And when you're in this forest, you realize how deep the history goes. What you see here are prayer flags and a monument to Genghis Khan. So this is a heavily Mongolian influenced region of South Central Siberia. And for people who grew up here, the forest is full of ancestors and full of spirits, not just trees and animals. And this is one of the spiritual leaders there, a guy named Norbulama, who had, when we visited him, was working on what I think it's best described as an indigenous protected area in the region where his culture is from, and where they have these long-standing relationships and traditions and practices in the forest. And it was really interesting to hear, and we describe this in the book, how there are moments when Russian society and politics gave space for this kind of idea, and then where there was retrenchment and a lot of resistance to this kind of acknowledgement of the indigenous people's place on the land. So we're going to jump back to the tropics here. And this is a person named Finche Momo who features in the book and was our guide in the forests of West Papua, where her people are from. And this is a mountain forest that, the best estimates are that humans have been in the forests of New Guinea going back 40 to 50,000 years. So her lineage can go back that far in these forests that you're looking at. This is a paradise kingfisher in Finche's clan's territory. I was trying to photograph a bird of paradise in this same spot here, but bird of paradise didn't show up. But I got a wonderful chance to observe this endemic native kingfisher. And I put this slide in here to show what a forest looks like when it's growing back. The people in New Guinea actively inhabit a part of their forest, but on a rotating basis. So this used to be where they grew all their crops a couple decades ago. And when I was first walking through there, I had no idea that I was walking through what used to be a farm and was regenerating to a natural forest. You see the in the upper left here, this is a pandanus tree, which is something that it's a native tree, but the locals enrich the forest, like take it and plant more of them because it's useful as a food and a medicine. And one of the topics we touch on, well, there's a whole chapter in the book on it, is the place that reforestation and tree planting has in strategies to conserve the forests of the world. You may have heard of the Trillion Trees Initiative and many other sort of mega tree planting enterprises. And those of us who've been in the field for decades, we've seen these sort of things come and go, and seen, relatively speaking, how inexpensive and effective natural regeneration is. So we talk about, first order of business is to keep the forest standing. Second is to rely on natural regeneration. And then third really is to look, where are you going to do tree planting? How can you do it most intelligently? How can you do it with multiple benefits for water, for carbon, for biodiversity with native species? So it's it's a complex issue that we try to make sense of it. So still in New Guinea, this is a member of the Abun tribe, which neighbors the Finches tribe. And we'd been walking through the forest for about 4 hours at night. I couldn't believe he knew where he was going. We were just walking through something that was sort of like one hill after another. And we near the end of the walk, and we described this in the book, he goes darting off the direction we were going and grabs something out of a tree, and he brings it over, and it's this king bird of paradise, this beautiful bird, and gave me a chance to take a photograph and check it out, and then let it go. And it was it brought home to me, one of the many lessons that we learned through the process of working on the book, and being with people who have been with forests, who live in forests, and whose generations upon generations of their ancestors have been in these same forests. The physicality of people's interaction with forests. So a king bird of paradise isn't something that you sort of stand back and respectfully look at. You go and grab it and check it out and interact with it. So it's good I appreciate having my assumptions about how we interact with nature shaken up. And there's no better way to do that than to be with people who actually live out in the natural setting. So we're going to pop back up to the boreal zone here. These are Casca elders in the Yukon territory. And my first interaction with them was to ask them how they said certain things in their language. And so I walked off the plane in Whitehorse in the Yukon thinking, I'm going to visit the boreal forest. And so I went and asked these guys, so how do you say forest in your language? And that was something I like to ask wherever I went, to just kind of hear what their concept of it was, what the etymology could tell us about the concept of forest. And these guys, they sort of scratched their heads and they thought about it and they talked to each other in Casca, their language. And after a while, they came up with one word, well, not really a word, a phrase. And then a day later, they came up with another one. So it took them 2 days to come up with 2 ways of saying forest in their language. And the first way was densely spruced. And all those trees that you can see in the background are indeed spruce trees, the dominant tree of the region. And the other wasn't a noun, it was a prepositional phrase. So it was among the sticks. So I had gone to see forest, and they really didn't have a word for this concept that I was going to write about. They had concepts about being in relationship with the space that gives rise to the idea of forest. But forest to them is not something that's separable from rivers, from tundra, from mountaintops, from sky, from lakes, from the wetlands. And there was a moment of I would say maybe a moment of doubt, like, what is this project I'm working on? We've taken this concept in English of forest and made it our focus over 2 years of research and writing, and it doesn't even exist in some of these places that have the most of this forest stuff. So it's another instance for me of what I find really enriching, of going and looking at things through a different lens, through a different language, And a lot of the problem solving that I think we need to do around our environmental challenges is exactly to see things from different angles, and particularly from the angles that have been formed through long empirical multi-generational existence with these natural systems. So this is just another shot of the Casca territory. Fire is a huge issue in the boreal forests. This is a biologist, a guy named Reid, who studies the impact of fire on particularly snowshoe hares, which we describe in the book. And while fire has always been a natural force that makes the boreal forest into a mosaic of different aged plots, if you will, of forests that serve different species at different times, the intensity and the frequency of the fire is increasing with climate change, such that those cycles are getting shortened and interrupted, and certain stages of forest, particularly the later stages of mature forests, are getting diminished on the landscape, which, as you can imagine, is problematic for the species that, like caribou, that depend on those mature forests. So we're going to end our tour in the Amazon. And these two guys belong to two different indigenous tribes. They're neighbors. The guy on the left is named Tamasaimpa, and the guy on the left is named Waki Mairuna. They're from the Marubo and the Mairuna tribes. And they live in a place called the Javari Valley, which is a massive indigenous territory. It's 20 million acres. So that's a few Connecticuts. I'm not sure how many, but it's around the size of Maine or South Carolina. And they share territory with isolated tribes, or what we sometimes call uncontacted tribes, that have no interaction with the modern world. So these two guys are from tribes that traditionally were at war with each other up until around the late 1980s. And so Waki's people had blood feuds with Tamasaimpa's father and his ancestors. But in modern times, as they have been faced with common enemies or common challenges, they've banded together to form an alliance to defend this huge territory that they share with each other and with the uncontacted tribes. And part of the work that I do in my job is to support them in their work to steward this area. And not surprisingly, one of the big conclusions that we came out with in the book about, okay, so what can we do, is to support the work of people like them who have the knowledge, who have the legitimacy, who are on the land and who are fierce defenders of it, recognize the rights that they have to that territory, recognize them as partners in this global project that we need to take seriously about protecting forest land. So this is just an aerial shot of a mature Samauma tree, which is sacred to several of the tribes in the area. And the last slide here is a map. And this is just to illustrate what I was mentioning about the isolated tribes. Each dot on this map shows the location of one group of humans that live in this situation of voluntary isolation. This is a map of the Brazilian Amazon, so there are other tribes in Peru and in Colombia. And when I started getting involved in this issue a few years ago, from my own more conservation economics background, it was a huge revelation to me that the Amazon is actually full of people that are living without contact with the modern world. And just in case folks are wondering, the brighter round, the more light colored round dots show where definitive field studies and overflights have confirmed the existence of that group, and the other ones are places where it's still research is still going on to confirm the presence of those peoples. But for example, I just got a text today from a friend who works on this issue in Brazil, telling me that I believe it's either this group or this group here in the northern Amazon was just confirmed. So there are many of these dots that are have been unstudied, but they're definitely going to be confirmed in the future. And I think just to finish, one thing that this really, the existence of people who have enough space that they can choose to exist in this state of isolation speaks to the scale of the natural systems that still exist in these places, and that once that scale is lost, once fragmentation happens, once people are contacted against their will, once languages are melted into the melting pot of the national societies, those are irreversible things. And I think one of the things that is most motivating to me, and I think to my late co-author, Tom Lovejoy, is any opportunity that we have to prevent some irreversible loss of natural or cultural richness is something worth spending a whole lot of time on. So I'm going to stop my share there, and I'm going to read a short couple of paragraphs here. So Tom and I came out of the work on this book and our own decades of work in conservation with three main strategies that we wanted to highlight for policymakers. One that I just mentioned, which is to uphold the rights of indigenous peoples to their ancestral territories. A second is outside of those areas to massively expand protected areas, meaning national parks and other kinds of reserves that are held by the public. And thirdly, to keep road building out of the forest. So roads are the biggest, most important, most destructive vector of intact forests. And many of the roads that I've studied over the years as an economist are misuses of public funds. So do those three things, and we've got a real chance of succeeding in this project of saving the megaforests. But they're not enough. And so here is the little bit that I wanted to read to you. These strategies hold promise for a future in which vibrant, planet-sustaining forests will benefit the lives of descendants so distant they won't know our names. But saving the megaforests requires more than strategy and tactics. This is a job that needs to be done with feeling. In the modern world, the beings and features of the forests, and even the forests themselves, are commonly thought of as objects. We humans are separate subjects acting upon them, and nearly all verbs, if we think of it grammatically, are ethically tolerable. cut, dig, clear, gather, manage, thin, burn. This separation is rare among forest peoples. Little Anastasia Momo's family, Anastasia Momo is the niece of Pinche, the one I showed you the picture of. Little Anastasia Momo's family may go back 50,000 years in New Guinea's forests. Like most clans here, the Momos have an origin story reaching into a pre-human realm. They identify black cockatoos, like the ones flying around us on this hillside in the Tambrau Mountains, as ancestors. Nearby clans ascribe that role to tree kangaroos or masked snakes, creatures with whom long, unbroken lines of ancestors have shared the forest shade. People we have met over the years and others we interviewed for this book repeat refrains about kinship and obligation to the various forms of non-human forest life that sustain them. Accounts abound about times when people and animals were fully conversant in the same language. Some still talk. For modern humanity to keep the megaforests, and with them, the one planet we know of that has any forests, we need to care for the world as if it is family. We need to attempt a grammar in which subject and object, people, and everything else are the same. In a material and evolutionary sense, of course, we absolutely are. So thanks for listening, folks, and I welcome your questions.
I have someone who typed in the regeneration process of the forest, is there a problem with invasive species?
In the kinds of forests that we talk about in our book, the invasive species are not the kind of issue that they are that we experience around here in California or in Europe. There are invasive species, but their impacts in these intact ecosystems is minimal compared to more fragmented systems. So I'm afraid that's as well as I can answer that question. But I'll just say that in doing the research for the book, in these kind of settings, invasive species did not crop up as a major issue.
Yeah. It says, who sponsors most of this research?
So there's a lot of research that goes on in megaforests, and there are a lot of notes at the back of the book, so you can see, kind of get a notion of what the research is about. But I would say there are universities, governments, international institutions, development agencies. So to group those into under one rubric, I would say they're public entities with a scientific mission.
Someone asked, what role does politics play in safeguarding these forests?
Politics is huge. So as some of you might know, Brazil has an election coming up next Sunday. And one of the candidates is a chap named Jair Bolsonaro, and the other is somebody who goes by the name Lula. And Bolsonaro, in his 4 years as president of Brazil, has been a complete disaster for the rainforest. He has attacked the indigenous people's established constitutional rights to their territories. He has defunded the Parks Agency, the Environmental Agency, the federal police. And so he's just sort of taken all this incredible progress that Brazil made in the early 2000s and tried to obliterate it. So politics plays a huge role. And I would say Brazilians are on the cusp of rejecting Bolsonaro and his politics. And politicians need to know that climate writ large is a priority for the constituents, and that these natural systems that are a part of our climate solution are also important to people. So politics starts with us, and I'm encouraged by the fact that in 2016, neither of our presidential candidates talked about climate at all. In 2020, one of our presidential candidates talked about climate quite a bit, and that it's come as far as it has in US politics, to the extent that one of perhaps the biggest thing that Biden is likely to get done is on climate, is encouraging.
That sounds good. There's another question that someone wrote in. Are there other forests that are not classified as a megaforest, but are almost similar in size?
So there's nothing similar in size, but there are a couple of forests that we would love to have written about. One is the temperate forests in Patagonia. And those you have, the map that I showed at the beginning is in the book. And if you look at that, there's this dark patch in southern South America, in Chile, where you have an extent of intact temperate forest. Now that is rare because most of the temperate forests in the world have been cut down or fragmented, because those are the places where it's most comfortable for humans to live. So I would point to that one. I would also point to the island of Borneo, and there's an intact core with incredible biological importance in the island of Borneo, which is shared between the countries of Indonesia and Malaysia. But also, I think it's worth mentioning that these huge forests are not the only important forests in the world. And the work that we can do on bringing back forests in other regions is also important. And, like I grew up in the redwood region of California, 95% of old growth redwoods were cut, roads were put in, and it's a highly fragmented ecosystem. And yet the redwood forest have incredible capacity to absorb carbon and to just delight us. And one of the most important things that came through in our conversations with people who live in these big forests is the importance of just, fall in love with the forest that's close to you, that you can get to, that you can revel in. Because part of what has to change is our minds through contact with nature.
That kind of goes with this. Do any of these forests have protections?
Yes, so they do. The protections, the two main kinds of protections that are most effective, one is being protected by the people who are from that forest and have been there for a very long time, who are often called indigenous people. And their protection is stronger in some countries than in others. So in Brazil, for example, they have very strong protections, very strong rights. In Colombia, they have very strong rights. In Russia, they have weak rights. In the Congo Basin countries, they have weak rights. In New Guinea, indigenous peoples own 90% of the land.
Wow.
Under customary forms of it's not really ownership, but customary forms of landholding. So it varies quite a bit, and that really is the foundation or the biggest pillar of protection that we have. The second one is protection in, like Yosemite or the Redwood National Park, or huge protected areas that are being created in the Amazon and in Canada. And so there's something right now, a global initiative that's called 30 by 30. And what that means is to protect 30% of the land area of the planet by 2030. And that's seen as the, I don't know if I would say the minimum, but that's like the target that we need to hit to avert the worst of the crisis of biological diversity loss. And right now, as of 2020, we were at about 17%.
Oh.
But that's up from single digits in 1990. So there's a lot of protection going on. We need more.
This question kind of goes with that. Do you feel optimistic or pessimistic about the future of the megaforests?
So I think I feel optimistic as just that's the kind of person I am. And I feel optimistic, not necessarily about what things are going to look like in 10 years or 20 years, but what things could look like in 300, 400, 500 years. And I think with the way climate change works, that's the timescale on which we have to think about and frame our hopes. Because it's going to take a long time for the greenhouse gases that we put in the atmosphere to work their way through, and for natural systems to find new equilibria for species that are going to migrate. But in the meantime, what we can do is hold physical space for natural processes to unfold. So in the Yukon, for example, this was really starkly apparent. The changes are happening faster in the northern latitudes than in other parts of the world. And so instead of calling things biomes is the technical term for basically a biological community, they're starting to call them cliomes. So these are climate biological communities, and they're moving fast. And we have very little control over how this happens. But what the biologists are saying is, that using a theater metaphor, we can't necessarily save all the actors or have control at that level, but we can preserve the stage on which these evolutionary and adaptive processes are going to take place. So I would say we talk about hope toward the end of the book, and I'd be interested what the readers think, but we really think of it as, if we get our act together in terms of our human abilities to cooperate, our human ability for restraint in how we use the physical world, and our ability to think about our planet as home, and think about the other people here and the other species as the other people who live in our house, in other words, our family. And have those same kind of obligations and relationships with them that we would with members of our family.
Great idea. There's another question. Are carbon credits helpful for saving the forests? Other tools that link those without forests to those who want to profit from their land?
So we do have a chapter on carbon credits and what people call climate finance. And so I'll just say that to date, the most successful initiatives of this kind have been large government-to-government deals, where, for example, the government of Norway says to the government of Brazil, we're going to pay you a bunch of money, and we want the money to be spent to stop deforestation. So that's a caricature, but that is basically what these arrangements entail. And Brazil takes that money and spends it on the agencies that take care of the forest. They give grants to indigenous communities. They spend money on research, on tools to track land use. So all these things that really make a difference for the forest and for the climate. What we think of when we think of carbon credits are these deals where, well, I pay $10 and somebody keeps a ton of CO2 from being emitted to the atmosphere for me somewhere in the forest or in some other kind of project. The problem with those projects is that it's very, very difficult to establish without the $10 payment that I made, what would have happened to that place? What's the counterfactual, if you will, that if I didn't spend that money, would that forest still have stayed there anyway? Or if I save that forest, will something be logged in the next guy's property because the loggers will just go down the road and cut some other trees? Yeah. So those sort of issues, the difficulty of, I guess you could say the accounting system around carbon credits have been really, really tricky. Very, great minds have been at work on this and are continuing to work on this. I'd say the current state of the trend is toward carbon credits that are traded at the, anybody can buy them, but they're generated at the country level. So you don't have this dynamic of, oh, somebody walked down the road and just cut some other trees. Well, those other trees are going to count against the carbon credits if they're cut down. So you get more of a closed system. So that's where things are going, but it's still tough.
Let me get some more questions in here. Can you suggest some forests in the Northeast that would be recommended for visiting?
Well, that's a good question. I did go to school in the Northeast. I would say I only went to Maine once, but it was beautiful.
Yeah.
And I've been to a bunch of forests up around Western Mass in the Berkshires. There's beautiful places there. But I can't represent myself as much of an expert on the best places to go.
No, we could start with Maine.
Yeah.
How do you regain forests? Question. How did we go from single digits to 20%? Is there a lot of replanting to do? Wait, is there a lot of replanting, or do forests just go back to what they were?
Okay, so I hear a couple of different questions in there.
Yeah.
About how did we go from single digits to 20%? I think that's referring to what I was describing about protected areas. So those are forests that existed, not just forests, but other kinds of ecosystems too, that existed and were brought under formal protection. That happens because motivated people with politics that favor the environment, entrepreneurial public officials get in there and get stuff done. And there have been pulses of additions to the world's protected areas, and their particular political moments, also driven by the science, where more and more people are recognizing that to have a healthy climate, we have to have healthy land. So as far as how forests come back, if there's still a healthy forest near the forest that's been cut down, in many, many instances, the forest that's been cut down can come back just through natural regeneration. There will be a seed stock in the soil. There are seed sources nearby. The species that are needed to pollinate and spread seeds are present in those adjacent forests. So there's always going to be some loss with fragmentation, but as long as you've got some healthy forest around, that's the best way for the forest to come back. Now, it may need an assist in some places. And we describe the dynamics of working with farmers in the Amazon, for example, and how planting trees that give them some immediate short-term benefit is important to the larger reforestation effort.
Someone asked, how did you get interested in forests?
Oh gosh, probably just running around in them as a teenager. And I didn't think it was going to be a job until my mid-20s when I had tried some other fields of employment. And I went and volunteered on a project in Brazil when I was 25 or 26, and I was hooked after that.
Yeah. Someone wants to know who owns most of these forests. Is it the countries or commercial?
The countries.
Okay. So that's a good thing, I guess. Better than commercial enterprise.
Yeah, it is, because once it's a commercial enterprise, I'll just give a quick example. I know we're running out of time here, but here in California, we had a lumber company called Pacific Lumber, and they had a lot of old growth forest. And it was the late 80s, early 90s. They still had old growth forest. And they had a very conservative pace of logging. And so their balance sheet looked like it had this huge asset on it, and then very modest cash flow to go with that. So they were taken over, they were bought out, and the old growth forests were liquidated to make the company make more sense in the market. And so that's what you're always going to have, particularly with publicly traded companies. Their fiduciary responsibility is going to drive them to do things that are unsustainable. So yes, it's generally, there are exceptions to visionary, where you do see visionary private ownership at large scales, like the Tompkins family in Chile and some other examples. But generally, the forests that we still have at scale are public.
Okay, I think we might get one more question in. It says, how much time do you spend in forests, and are you welcomed by the locals?
I don't spend nearly enough time. In my career, I've spent a lot of time in hotel rooms and offices and conferences, but I do get to go out in the woods recreationally here close to home and in my work. And one thing that really led to the book was I took several months off from work in 2016. And during that time was when that picture with the lightning bolt was taken. And I just spent the time in forests in the Amazon and Patagonia and puzzled about, what is it we need to do better by our forests. So that time for reflection's really important.
Well, thank you so much. I want to tell everyone the title again: Saving Big Forests to Save the Planet Evergreen by John W. Reid and Thomas Lovejoy. And let's see, we do have one copy here, and they have plenty of copies over at Barrett Bookstore, so stop by tomorrow. And thank you so much, John. It was fascinating. I didn't know this at all, so I certainly learned a lot tonight, and I'm sure other people did too. We had a nice audience. So good luck with the book, and thank you for spending your night with us.
Well, thanks for the invitation, and I hope people enjoy it.
Okay, thanks everyone. We'll see you next week. Bye.